I knew all the rules. I signed off on disciplinary orders, gave lectures on professional conduct, looked the other way when other officers blurred the lines. I was someone they feared and someone they trusted. But one day, he looked at me, not as a guard, but as a woman. And from that look, my freedom began. And so did my downfall. Because love behind bars isn't a romance, it's a sentence. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Margaret Dawson, but most people at the prison just called me Officer Dawson. Some called me Miss D if they were being polite, Iron Maggie if they were trying to get under my skin. I was 42 years old and had spent more than half my adult life walking concrete corridors, listening to the buzz of electric doors, and memorizing the weight of keys on my hip like they were an extension of my body. I worked as a corrections officer at Penwood State Correctional Facility in Georgia, a medium security prison for women. The walls were tall, the fences wrapped in coils of razor wire, and the air smelled of metal, bleach, and resignation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, predictable, safe. The first time I put on the uniform, I felt a kind of power I didn't know I needed. The starch in the collar, the shine of the badge, the tightness of the belt. It all made sense. It was a shell, a way to keep the world at arm's length. I didn't come from much. My father had been a career army man who raised me with the same discipline he barked at his recruits. My mother died when I was 11. After that, it was just me, my younger sister, and a house full of rules. Emotions weren't useful. They were distractions. So I put them away, like folded clothes in a drawer no one opened. I never married, never had kids. I wasn't the kind of woman who made space for softness. My life was a cycle. 12-hour shifts, black coffee, evening walks with my dog Bruno, and the occasional phone call from my sister, who lived 2 states over with her family and a life I could never quite relate to. She always said I was too hard on myself. I never knew how to be any other way. Penwood was its own ecosystem. We were the watchers, they were the watched. The line between us was thick, sharp, and permanent. I wasn't cruel. I didn't yell or hit or humiliate, but I believed in order, in rules. I knew the manual by heart. I trained younger officers, led briefings, filed reports with precision. I knew which inmates were volatile, which were manipulators, which needed space, and which needed watching. I prided myself on being impossible to read. That's how you lasted in that job. If they sensed a crack in your armor, they'd find it, push it, split it wide open. I started every day the same way. I arrived at 6:45 a.m., went through the security check, nodded to the other officers, clipped my radio on, and reviewed the logbook. I knew the rhythm of the place like the back of my hand, the shift rotations, the meal schedules, the tension that built before visits or after lockdowns. I could tell by the way a woman walked whether she'd had a phone call or a court date, whether she was angry or afraid. That kind of intuition didn't come from kindness. It came from habit. You had to stay one step ahead, always. The uniform helped. It erased me. No makeup, hair tied back, boots polished, shirt tucked. No perfume, no jewelry, no expression. I was just a set of eyes behind a shield. The inmates didn't know if I liked jazz or country, if I dreamed of anything at all. And I preferred it that way. Anonymity was safety. Distance was survival. The truth was, I liked the quiet of authority. I liked walking the tears and hearing the silence follow. I liked knowing that I could stop a fight with a look. I liked being needed, even if no one said it out loud. It was the kind of control I never had growing up. The kind of control that made sense when everything else didn't. Sometimes I wondered if the other guards felt it too. That slow erosion of self. You start off thinking you'll only be here a few years until you figure things out. But the pay is steady, the benefits are decent, and before you know it, 5 years turns into 10, 10 into 20, and you forget who you were before. The lines blur, the concrete soaks into your bones. I wasn't unhappy, that's important to say. People always assume that if a woman doesn't smile, she must be broken. But I wasn't. I had a life that fit me. Tight, maybe. A little cold, but clean, defined. I didn't need anyone. That was my badge of honor. Dependence was weakness, and I'd learned early that love was a gamble I couldn't afford to lose. There were rules for everything at Penwood. Where you stood, how you spoke, how far you stayed from an inmate when you talked. Eye contact was allowed, but not too long. Touch was forbidden. Familiarity was a threat. We were taught to be alert, detached, in control. And I was all of those things, until I wasn't. But back then, before it happened, before the fall, I was just Officer Dawson. Respected, feared, reliable. I ran a tight unit. I followed the chain of command. I didn't drink on duty. I didn't gossip in the break room. I didn't make mistakes. That's the thing no one tells you about falling, how slowly it starts, how quiet the first crack is, how it can begin in a place where you feel strongest. I believed I was untouchable. That's why it worked. That's why it broke me. At the end of each shift, I'd peel off the uniform like armor. My skin always felt too thin afterward. I'd shower, heat up a frozen meal, and sit with Bruno curled at my feet, staring at the TV without really seeing it. Sometimes I'd stand at the window and watch the neighbors in their little dramas. Husbands taking out trash, teenagers sneaking in late, porch lights flickering. They all seemed so far away, like a different country. One I'd never learned the language for. I didn't know then what was coming. I didn't know that my fortress had a fault line, that beneath all the routine and discipline, there was something human still flickering, a need I had buried so deep I forgot it had a name. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even hope. It was a glance, a hesitation, a second too long in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was enough, enough to begin unraveling everything I had spent my whole life building, enough to remind me that even the strongest walls can be breached from the inside. It happened gradually, the way frost creeps along glass, slow, delicate, barely noticeable until the whole pane is covered. I didn't see the moment it began, but I can trace its outline now, like the shape of a scar. There was no dramatic shift, no rule shattered with noise and consequence. It was quieter than that, more dangerous for it. Her name was Kyla Monroe, inmate 87351, 29 years old, serving 15 years for armed robbery and assault. She came in silent, like a breath held too long. Some inmates came in with fire, with sobs, with the crackling sound of their life exploding behind them. Not her. She entered with the stillness of someone already used to loss. No screaming, no resistance, just eyes that didn't blink enough and a posture too straight for a caged body. I noticed her first because she didn't try. Not to please, not to manipulate, not even to survive the way others did, with alliances and smiles and whispered favors. She moved through the unit like a ghost that refused to haunt. She didn't make friends. She didn't make noise. She read slowly, wrote even slower, and ate like food was a debt she hadn't earned. There was a calm about her that unsettled me. It wasn't resignation, it was defiance, but dressed in silence. I told myself that's why I started watching her more closely, that it was about security, about intuition, that something didn't sit right. But the truth was, it wasn't her actions that caught my attention. It was her presence. The way she looked at the world like she was already on the outside of it. Like the walls didn't impress her. Like she had already been in a deeper prison before we ever handed her the uniform and number. She reminded me of myself in ways I didn't want to admit. The posture, the silence, the refusal to let the world in. I saw it before I could name it. That's how mirrors work. They don't ask permission to show you what you've been avoiding. Our first real interaction wasn't even a conversation. She dropped a library book during a routine check. I bent to pick it up and handed it to her. Our fingers didn't touch, but our eyes did. That was all. A glance, not long, not inappropriate, but something passed between us in that fraction of a second. A recognition, a shift. I walked away faster than I should have, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. I told myself it was nothing. Just vigilance, a response to an unusual inmate. But my thoughts lingered longer than they should have. I caught myself looking for her in the cafeteria line, during yard time, scanning for the shape of her among rows of orange and gray. I started assigning myself to her block more often. I justified it easily. Staffing shortages, schedule gaps, my seniority giving me flexibility. No one questioned it. I didn't give them a reason to. But inside, I felt it. The shift, the tilt. That invisible line between officer and inmate wasn't a wall. It was a thread, and I had begun to pull it. Kyla never spoke out of turn, but she looked. Not in the way some inmates tried to flirt their way out of trouble. Not with desperation or calculation. She looked with curiosity, with clarity, like she was trying to understand the shape of my silence, the way I was trying to understand hers. There's something dangerous about being seen when you've spent your life building a wall around yourself. It makes you feel exposed, and it makes you want more. I began noticing things I shouldn't have. That she read poetry, real poetry, not just the kind inmates picked up to look smart. That she paused in front of the rec yard roses every day, even when they weren't blooming. That she wrote in tiny, perfect script and folded her letters twice before sealing them. Details, human details, the kind that blur lines. I stopped being Officer Dawson when I thought about her. I became just a woman who hadn't been looked at that way in a very long time. Not with desire, with recognition. I still did my job. I filed reports, broke up fights, enforced curfews. But part of me was elsewhere, somewhere quieter, somewhere I wasn't proud of, but couldn't leave, a place where I didn't feel hollow. One night, after a long shift, I sat in my car outside my house for nearly an hour before going in. The engine off, the world still. I stared at the steering wheel, her face flickering behind my eyes, and I realized something terrifying. I had built a life on distance, on control, on knowing who I was and where I stood, and she had undone all of it without saying a word. From that moment on, I knew I was walking a razor's edge. Every step I took was calculated, every word monitored, but the more I tried to pull back, the more drawn I felt. It wasn't love, not then. It wasn't lust. It was gravity. The slow, undeniable force of something pulling you off the path you've walked your whole life. I told myself I could handle it, that I hadn't broken any rules, that a few glances and thoughts didn't make me weak. But I had been around long enough to know that the most dangerous breaches aren't the ones you see, they're the ones you deny. I started dreaming of her, not in the way that made me sweat, but in the way that made me ache. In dreams, she wasn't an inmate. I wasn't a guard. We were just two women standing in a hallway with no walls. Just space, just silence, just understanding. The next day, I assigned myself to library duty. I told myself it was coincidence, but the lie tasted sour in my mouth. She was there, reading Baldwin. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. That day, the thread snapped, quietly, invisibly. The line, once clear, had faded completely, and I didn't try to redraw it. There are sounds that only a prison can make. The clang of steel doors closing, the scrape of boots against concrete, the low hum of fluorescent lights that never sleep. After years inside, I stopped hearing them as noise. They became part of the air I breathed, the rhythm of my days. But after her, even the silence had a new tone. It wasn't emptiness anymore, it was anticipation. It began with small things: a folded page left on a desk, a name scribbled on a library request form that didn't belong to her, glances that lingered half a second too long. We didn't speak beyond what the job required. We didn't dare. But something passed between us, wordless, dangerous, undeniable. A language made of pauses and stillness, of what we didn't say. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was inventing meaning in the blank spaces of routine. But every day the current between us grew stronger. She'd look up during head count, and I'd forget the number I was on. She'd walk by during rec time, and my throat would tighten. There was no reason for her to occupy my thoughts, yet she did. Like smoke, like breath, like a secret that wanted to live. I began noticing her habits in painful detail. She always sat in the back of the dining hall, facing the door. She never ate the bread. She turned her plastic cup clockwise 3 times before drinking. Her eyes were a pale kind of gray, not cold but unreadable, like the sky before a storm. And she smiled rarely, but when she did, it was brief, almost guilty, as if joy were contraband she could be caught with. The more I tried to distance myself, the more the prison itself conspired against me. I was assigned to her block more often. Sometimes she was assigned to cleaning duties near my station. Routine coincidences, the kind no one questions. But each one was a spark. And when you work surrounded by stone, even the smallest spark can start a fire. I started to change in ways no one else could see. I lingered in corridors longer than necessary. I stayed late to finish reports that didn't need finishing. I walked slower past her cell. The prison had taught me to be invisible, but now I moved like I wanted to be seen. Every rule I broke was quiet, private, invisible to anyone but me, and maybe her. It wasn't rebellion. It was need. One night during inspection, I found a scrap of paper tucked into a stack of library books that hadn't been logged yet. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but I knew it was meant for me. The handwriting was small, neat, precise. It said only 6 words. The walls remember more than we do. I read it 3 times before slipping it into my pocket. My heart hammered against the fabric of my uniform as if it wanted to burst out. I should have reported it, logged it as contraband. Instead, I kept it. That note lived under my pillow for weeks. I read it until the words began to fade, until the meaning began to change. I began writing back, not with my name, not directly to her, but to the silence between us. I left a line written in pencil in the margin of a book. Some walls keep secrets better than people. I knew it was foolish, reckless, unprofessional, but it felt human. It felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. After that, it became a rhythm, a note hidden in a book, a phrase tucked between pages, a thought slipped into the cracks of our duties. It wasn't romance, not in any ordinary sense. It was confession through code, the kind of intimacy that exists only where words can't. The thrill wasn't in being found out. It was in being known, completely, silently. The walls around us didn't care. They had seen worse sins, heard darker secrets. Yet, in that gray monotony, our small rebellion glowed. I would trace her handwriting with my fingertip late at night, memorizing the way she formed her letters, the pressure of her pen. It felt like touching her without touching her. I would imagine her doing the same, somewhere in her cell, under the same cold light. I started to smile again, quietly, secretly, like she did. It frightened me, that spark of life returning after years of numbness. Happiness felt like a betrayal, to my job, to my past, to the person I had built myself into. But I couldn't stop it. It was a warmth I hadn't felt in decades, a pulse under the skin of routine. One morning, during inspection, I found another note, just a single sentence. Even cages can echo with softness. I read it standing in the empty corridor, sunlight spilling through barred windows, dust floating in the air like ash. For a moment, the prison didn't feel like a place of punishment. It felt like a confession booth, a sanctuary for people who weren't supposed to feel anything at all. The fear came later, the realization that this, whatever it was, could ruin us both. I began to notice the other guards watching me. A few whispers, a few side glances. I became sharper again, stricter, colder, trying to bury what had started to bloom. I punished small infractions with unnecessary precision, raised my voice more often, forced my face back into stone. But it was too late. The mask didn't fit the same way anymore. At night, I would hear the buzz of the gates closing and imagine the sound as a heartbeat. I began dreaming in flashes, her face behind glass, her hands on the table in visitation, her eyes when she looked up and didn't need to say anything. I woke with my chest aching, my sheets tangled, the taste of her name like copper in my mouth. One evening, during head count, our eyes met for a fraction longer than usual. A second stretched into an eternity. The hallway went quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath. No one saw it. No one spoke. But I knew, and she knew, that something irreversible had passed between us. That night, I sat alone in the staff locker room, the air thick with detergent and metal. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to see the woman I had been before. The uniform looked the same, the face the same, but something inside had shifted. I wasn't Officer Dawson anymore. I was someone else, someone who could no longer tell where the line was, or if it had ever truly existed. The secret grew heavy but alive. It pulsed under every word I said, under every rule I followed. It was ours, hidden beneath layers of concrete and silence, where no one could find it. The prison had its eyes everywhere, but even it couldn't see this fragile, forbidden spark between two people who weren't supposed to feel anything at all. I didn't know then how much it would cost me. I only knew that I couldn't let it go. The walls might have remembered more than we did, but for the first time in years, I wanted to remember too. It started with a whisper. They always do. A rumor passed from one mouth to another, small enough to seem harmless at first, just a flicker in the air. But prisons are living things. They breathe gossip like oxygen. Every secret, no matter how well buried, finds a crack to crawl through. And mine began to crawl. I didn't see it coming. Not the way you imagine a downfall, not with flashing lights or shouted accusations. It came like a slow infection, quiet, steady, invisible, until it was too late. The first sign was a look from another officer, too long, too knowing. Then a shift in the air during morning briefing, the sudden hush when I entered the room. People who had once nodded to me now turned away mid-sentence. The silence of suspicion is louder than any words. I told myself I was imagining it. I had been working too many shifts, sleeping too little. But the unease spread. I caught a sergeant watching me one afternoon, eyes sharp and cold. He smiled when I looked his way, but it wasn't kindness, it was confirmation. The kind of smile people wear when they've already decided what they believe. The next morning, I was called into the warden's office. The walk there felt endless. My boots struck the linoleum in slow, deliberate beats, each one echoing like a countdown. The secretary didn't meet my eyes. She told me to wait inside. The warden wasn't a cruel man, but he had the composure of someone who'd buried his empathy long ago. He didn't accuse. He asked questions, too many, too specific. Had I noticed any unusual behavior among the inmates? Had I had any personal communication with a prisoner under my supervision? My answers were calm, rehearsed, professional, but inside something trembled. When I left, the air outside felt heavier. I walked the corridor back to the staff wing and could feel eyes tracking me, invisible but unmistakable. I had lived by the rule of control my entire life, but that day I realized how fragile it was. One rumor could burn through 20 years of loyalty faster than fire through dry grass. They searched the cells that afternoon. A random inspection, they said, but I knew better. I was stationed 3 blocks away, ordered to stand aside. When I heard my name called over the radio, my stomach turned to water. They had found something. Later, I learned it was a scrap of paper hidden behind a pipe, the edges damp, the handwriting faint. My handwriting. I had been careless once, months before, leaving a note where it shouldn't have been. Nothing explicit, no names, just words, too human for a guard, too tender for duty. I had written it in a moment of weakness, thinking it would disappear like the dust on those gray walls. But walls don't forget. They remember everything. I was suspended pending investigation. That phrase followed me like a shadow. I packed my locker in silence, the clatter of my keys against metal the only sound in the room. The other officers avoided my eyes, as if looking at me might contaminate them. I felt their judgment in every movement, every whisper that stopped when I passed. The woman who had once trained recruits, who had enforced discipline without flinching, now walked the halls like an inmate already condemned. The interrogation came next. Hours in a room with no clock, no windows, just a table and 2 chairs. They asked the same questions over and over, reshaping them, twisting them, searching for the crack where the truth would slip out. I denied nothing and confessed to nothing. I had learned long ago that silence was its own form of defense, but even silence can be used against you. They showed me the paper, my words, black and faded, under the sterile light. It didn't look dangerous. It looked small, almost innocent, but in that room, it was enough to redefine me. The warden looked at me for a long time before speaking. He said I'd broken the trust that held the system together, that I had crossed a line no officer should ever cross. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for forgiveness. The truth was, I didn't have the strength to. I just nodded, like someone who already knew the ending. When I was escorted out, I saw her for the last time. She was in the corridor, standing behind the line of other inmates being moved to the yard. Our eyes met for one suspended heartbeat. There was no panic in hers, no guilt, only sadness, recognition. It was the kind of look that made the noise of the world vanish for a second. Then the moment broke. She turned away, and I kept walking. Outside the gates, the air felt wrong. The world beyond the fences was too open, too bright. My body had grown used to confinement. Freedom felt like vertigo. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The uniform was still on my body, but it no longer belonged to me. I was already a ghost inside it. The official letter came a week later. Termination, conduct unbecoming, violation of policy, no mention of love. Love doesn't exist in official language. They can name your offense, but not your heart. The paper trembled in my hands as I read it, not from shock, but from the weight of inevitability. It was over. Everything I had built, the discipline, the reputation, the armor, collapsed into a single line of text. People began to vanish from my life without saying goodbye. Colleagues who used to share coffee breaks stopped answering messages. My sister called once, then stopped when I didn't explain. Neighbors looked through me like I was something they couldn't acknowledge. Shame is contagious, and they didn't want to catch it. I sold my car, moved out of my house, and found a room in a forgotten part of town. The silence there was different from the silence in prison. It wasn't structured or guarded. It was hollow. At night, I could hear the trains passing, their whistles like ghosts calling from another life. I wondered if she could hear them too, wherever she was inside those walls. Months passed. The investigation turned into prosecution, charges of misconduct, abuse of power, breach of trust, words that stripped me of my humanity one by one. I sat in court wearing clothes that didn't feel like mine, surrounded by strangers who spoke about me as if I weren't there. They called me dangerous, manipulative, weak. They said I had compromised the integrity of the institution. No one asked why. No one cared to know that it had never been about corruption or control, but about connection, something small and fragile, something I had never been taught how to handle. When the verdict came, I didn't cry. The sentence was lighter than it could have been, but it didn't matter. Prison wasn't just a place anymore. It was a state of being I carried inside me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent half my life guarding cages only to end up in one of my own making. The day I entered the facility again, this time through a different gate, the air hit me with the same sterile chill I'd once thought of as safety. I felt the weight of the keys missing from my belt, the absence of authority in my step. The doors closed behind me, and for the first time, I understood the sound from the other side. It wasn't power, it was loss. They processed me like any other inmate: photos, fingerprints, uniform. I moved through the system I once upheld, one step at a time. The guards didn't look at me, and I didn't look at them. The walls were the same, the smell unchanged. The only difference was me. As I lay on the narrow bunk that first night, I thought about the paper that had destroyed everything. 6 words, faded with time, still living somewhere in an evidence folder. I wondered if anyone had read them aloud, if they had heard the tremor in my handwriting, the confession buried between the lines. The truth was, I had written that note not to her, but to myself. A message I hadn't been ready to understand until it was too late. The walls around me were gray and unyielding, but they pulsed with memory. I could almost hear them breathing, whispering back my own words. The walls remember more than we do. And they did. Time moved differently inside. It didn't flow like water. It thickened, like syrup in winter. Each hour stretched until it became shapeless, indistinguishable from the next. I woke when the lights came on and slept when they went off. But the space between those 2 points was endless, suspended. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sense of progress, only repetition, only endurance. My cell was small, concrete walls the color of dirty snow, a narrow cot, a sink that coughed rust, and a slit of a window too high to look through. The air smelled of detergent and exhaustion. I learned to recognize footsteps in the hallway, the voices of guards I didn't know, the rhythm of keys that no longer belonged to me. Everything that had once been familiar was now inverted. I was no longer the one who held the power of doors. I was the one waiting for them to open. At first, I resisted routine. I told myself I was different, that I still belonged to another world, one made of order and control. But the prison has its own way of eroding identity. It doesn't take it all at once. It wears it down piece by piece until what's left is something smaller, quieter, and entirely contained within those walls. The first thing that leaves you is pride, then anger, then the idea of time itself. The days were long, but the nights were longer. The hum of the lights outside the corridor became my clock. I would count the seconds between guard rounds, the echo of boots against the floor. Sometimes I imagined that sound belonged to me again, that I was still walking those halls in my uniform, still commanding silence instead of being swallowed by it. But the illusion always dissolved. The silence wasn't obedience anymore. It was absence. I wrote letters at first, dozens of them. To my sister, who had stopped answering calls after the trial. To colleagues whose names I still remembered, though I doubted they remembered mine. And to her. Always to her. I wrote them slowly, choosing every word like it mattered, even though I knew it didn't. The act of writing was the only way I could keep my thoughts from collapsing inward. I folded each letter neatly, sealed it, and handed it to the guard for collection. I imagined the letters traveling through air, crossing distance, carrying fragments of me into the world I no longer belonged to. None of them came back, not even a returned envelope, just silence. I told myself they were being delivered, that she had read them, that someone had read them. But deep down, I knew they were gone before they left this place, confiscated, discarded, forgotten. Paper ghosts. I stopped writing after the 15th, the last one I didn't seal. I left it open on my cot all night, watching the ink dry, and in the morning I tore it in half. Without the letters, my thoughts began to echo louder. There was nowhere for them to go. I spoke less, slept more. The other women in my block learned to leave me alone. To them, I was just another fallen officer, another reminder of what happened when power turned soft. Some of them tried to provoke me, to test the strength of the ex-guard in their midst. I never reacted. There was nothing left to defend. Meals were the only markers of time. Trays of lukewarm food slid through the slot, eaten without hunger. I began saving small pieces of bread, not to eat, but to break apart, to give my hands something to do. Crumbs scattered across the metal table like hours slipping away. The sound they made when I brushed them off became its own kind of comfort, small, private, insignificant, but mine. Sometimes I caught sight of myself in the scratched metal mirror above the sink. The face that looked back was both familiar and foreign. My hair had gone gray at the temples, my skin pale from the lack of sun. The uniform they gave me was identical to every other woman's here, but it fit differently. It was too big in some places, too tight in others. I wondered if she would recognize me now, if she could still see the person she once looked at without fear. The nights were hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks that looked like maps to nowhere. The cell hummed with whispers, ventilation, footsteps, distant coughing. I began to imagine stories in those sounds. The woman 2 cells down who cried every night, I decided she must have had children. The one who sang softly to herself had once been a teacher. We were all ghosts of something. I didn't know what kind of ghost I was. Weeks turned into months. I learned to count time by the sound of the mail cart. Every day the wheels squeaked down the corridor, stopping at each cell, a pause, a shuffle, a voice calling a name. I stopped hoping for mine after the first few months, but still, when the sound came near, my breath caught. Each day it passed me without stopping. Each day the silence afterward felt heavier. The cell without letters became its own sentence. One morning, I found a single sheet of paper slid under my door. For a moment, my chest filled with something too bright to name. But it wasn't from anyone I knew. It was a standard form, an inventory correction, meaningless. The hope that had risen in me vanished so fast it left an ache behind. I tore the paper into pieces and flushed it down the toilet, watching it dissolve into water. It felt like erasing a part of myself, but it also felt like surrender, like admitting I had nothing left to wait for. They gave us books sometimes, donated paperbacks, dog-eared and faded. I read them all, even the ones I didn't care about, just to make the days pass. Words became both my punishment and my salvation. I underlined sentences in my head because we weren't allowed pens anymore after someone used one as a weapon. I memorized lines until they became prayers. A few of them still echo in me even now, long after I've forgotten their sources. Words about forgiveness, about loneliness, about how time can both destroy and heal. There were moments, small ones, when I thought I saw her. Not her exactly, but a shape, a memory, a flicker in the corner of my mind. I would be standing in line for inspection, and a shadow would move just right, and my body would react before my mind could stop it. I would turn my head, heart racing, and see nothing but uniforms, faces, and walls. The mind plays tricks when it's starved for meaning. I began talking to the walls, not out loud, but in thought. I told them things I couldn't tell anyone else, about how the silence had grown teeth, about how the absence of her name hurt more than the confinement, about how, even now, I wasn't sure if what I felt had been love or simply the illusion of being seen for the first time. The walls didn't answer, but they didn't judge either. That was enough. Eventually, I stopped expecting change. My body adapted. My mind quieted. The days became smoother, like stones polished by water. I woke, ate, worked, slept. Sometimes I dreamed of open spaces, fields, oceans, the color blue without bars cutting through it. I always woke up before touching it. Then one day, the mail cart stopped at my cell again. The guard called my name, flatly, as if he didn't care. I walked to the door and took the envelope through the slot. My hands shook as I turned it over. There was no return address, no name, just my inmate number scrawled in ink. Inside was a single blank page. No words, no message, just silence made visible. I stared at it for a long time. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some administrative error. But the longer I looked, the more it felt deliberate. A response to all the letters that had vanished. An answer that said nothing and everything at once. I pressed it against my chest and sat down on the cot. For the first time in months, I cried. Not loud, not desperate, just quietly, steadily, until the tears ran out. After that, I kept the page under my pillow. It became a kind of relic, proof that I hadn't imagined everything, proof that someone, somewhere, still knew I existed. I never wrote back. I didn't need to. The silence had already said enough. Days continued. The world outside kept turning, and I remained here, in this small concrete box that no longer frightened me. The cell without letters had taught me something I hadn't wanted to learn, that sometimes love doesn't vanish. It just changes shape, becoming the air that fills the spaces you can't escape. They called it release, but it didn't feel like that. It felt more like being dismissed, like the story had ended without a final chapter, and someone had simply closed the book. No confetti, No fanfare, no welcome party. Just a plain envelope with my belongings, a change of clothes that didn't fit, and a bus ticket to a city I had never been to. A place far enough away that no one would recognize my face, but still familiar enough that it didn't feel like exile. I stepped through the gates on a morning that could have belonged to anyone. The sun was out, but not warm. The sky was clear, but not blue enough to feel like a sign. The air smelled of dew and diesel fuel, and my breath fogged slightly as I exhaled. The door behind me shut with a muted finality, and I stood there, holding the plastic bag of my life like a paperweight in my hands. My legs didn't move right away. I had waited years for this moment and didn't know how to take the first step. The bus stop was a quarter-mile away. I walked there slowly, every step feeling borrowed. The gravel under my shoes sounded too loud. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting a voice to call me back, to say there had been a mistake. But no one came. I was nobody again, and that was the point. On the ride into the city, I sat by the window, watching the trees blur past. They were changing color, shedding themselves in golds and reds, a different kind of release. I rested my forehead against the glass and watched the reflection of my face tremble with the motion of the road. I had lines where I didn't before. My eyes looked older, but I recognized her now, the woman staring back at me. I had hated her for so long. Now I wasn't sure what I felt, only that I could finally feel something. My new name came in a sealed envelope at the halfway house. It was printed neatly at the top of a stack of paperwork I had to sign. The name didn't sound like me. It felt like a borrowed coat. Stiff, strange smelling, still holding the shape of the last person who wore it. But I took it. I practiced writing it until the letters stopped trembling. I practiced saying it into the mirror until it didn't sound like someone else's voice. Margaret Dawson was gone. She had been erased from the system with the click of a key. What remained was a woman with a new ID, a state-issued card, and a job cleaning motel rooms for minimum wage. It was quiet work. No one asked questions. No one looked me in the eyes for too long. I was invisible again, but this time it didn't feel like armor. It felt like mercy. I lived in a room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked whenever I turned. The window faced the back alley, and at night I could hear the buzz of neon signs and the hum of air conditioners. I learned to sleep through it. I learned to move without being noticed. I folded sheets with precision. I scrubbed tile until the grout turned white. I collected quarters for the laundromat and waited in line with other women who didn't speak unless they had to. We were a kind of silent tribe, those trying to rebuild without drawing attention to the wreckage. Every now and then, I passed by people wearing uniforms, police officers, corrections officers, security guards. I'd cross the street, look away, feel my chest tighten. Not out of guilt anymore, but instinct. You learn to step around certain kinds of power once you've been crushed by it. I stayed out of trouble, reported to my parole officer, showed up to work early, smiled when I needed to, bit my tongue when I wanted to scream. Freedom, I learned, wasn't loud. It was quiet, fragile, a thing you protected, not a thing you celebrated. Some nights, I'd walk the streets just to remind my legs they could still carry me. I'd pass by diners, families, lovers holding hands. I never felt bitterness, only distance, like I was watching a movie with no sound. I could see it, but not touch it. I no longer knew how to live in that kind of world. Mine had edges. Mine was smaller, but it was mine. I thought about her sometimes. In the early hours of the morning, when the sky was just starting to soften into gray. I'd sit on the fire escape with a mug of weak coffee and wonder where she was, if she was still inside, if she ever thought of me. I didn't let the thoughts stay long. They came like waves, unexpected, sharp, then gone. I never tried to contact her. I didn't want to be a burden, a memory she had to carry. It was enough to know that, for a brief time, we had seen each other, really seen. That kind of connection doesn't need a future. It only needs truth. I kept the blank letter under my mattress, the one I had received on that final day inside. It came with me through every move, every night spent wondering if I could still be someone new. It wasn't just paper, it was proof that someone, somewhere, had heard me, that I hadn't disappeared entirely. The seasons passed. I got promoted, not by much, but enough to pay rent without fear. I rented a tiny apartment with a kitchenette and a window that actually opened. I bought a houseplant. I gave it a name. It died after 3 weeks, but I tried again. The second one lived. Eventually, I stopped flinching when people asked me questions. I stopped counting how many days I had been free. I stopped dreaming about cell doors and concrete ceilings. Freedom didn't come in one moment. It came in layers, like paint over old walls. It peeled sometimes, but it held. There were things I never talked about. The letters, the moments in the corridor, the way she had changed something inside me that I never knew was broken. Not because I was ashamed, but because some things belong only to the silence that gave them life. I carried her with me, not as a ghost, not as a wound, but as a reminder that even in the coldest places, warmth can find a way in. That even behind locked doors, two people can reach each other. That love, however brief, however forbidden, leaves a light behind. And sometimes, late at night, when the city quieted and the only sound was the wind brushing against my window, I would whisper my old name to the dark, just once, just to remind myself that I had survived her, that I had survived myself. And then I would sleep, under a new name, in a new life, free, not because they let me go, but because I chose to stay.